Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Kyler Cheatham, and we wanted to shift gears a bit now and continue on the thread that Kyler had brought up right before the break, which is this whole concept of pros and cons of cloud technologies and cloud systems. And for that, we actually had Sarah Dokovic, who interviewed Brian Potts from Third Stage, as well as myself, just to talk about some of the good, bad, and the ugly about cloud systems. So for those of you that don't know, Brian is a managing partner and chief client officer at Third Stage Consulting. So he's been with us since the start, since day one, and he knows the industry really well. So he and I are going to respond to some of Sarah's questions about cloud. So we'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
Eric and Brian, welcome to the show today.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having us.
Of course. I'm excited to have both of you on today. It's going to be a fun discussion. So before we dive into the specifics, I'd love to discuss the evolution of cloud computing with you guys. You've both had careers that span 20 plus years in this industry, and you've each watched the most popular software vendors make the transition from the very beginning. So when cloud technology was first introduced, did you guys think it would soon take over as a prominent solution for businesses in the years to come?
Well, maybe I'll take a first cut at that. When it first happened, there was a predecessor to cloud back in the early 2000s. Maybe it was in the late 90s, right early in my career when I was first starting out, and it was called ASP was what it was called. And it was sort of a early version of cloud where companies would host their solutions offsite in some other location, and it just had a different name than what we call cloud today. And for a while, for a short period, I remember there being a lot of hype behind ASP, and it never really got traction, and people seemed to really like their client server on-premise type of systems at the time. So it might have just been a movement that was a bit ahead of its time. So it had kind of come and gone one time already, and then it kind of emerged again in the, call it around 2010 or maybe a little bit after that, where a lot of companies were starting to migrate to the cloud. And I've always been a bit of a skeptic with cloud, only because I felt like it was more the vendors that were interested in moving people to the cloud because it was more recurring revenues, higher profits. There's a lot of reasons why they might like the cloud solutions. And I was always skeptical of whether or not it was really the best fit for organizations implementing ERP. But over time, as more and more vendors were investing heavily in cloud and putting a lot of R&D dollars in it, and we're actually rolling out viable cloud solutions, it sort of, I think, reached a bit of a tipping point within the last few years. And even more recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's really further fueled the transition and fueled that tipping point where a lot of organizations are dealing with remote workforces that can't all be in the same location all at one time. So cloud solutions are much more viable or important to them. So I don't know that I necessarily knew when or how or if cloud adoption would happen, but being independent and technology agnostic, we've just always questioned and challenged the notion that everyone needs to be in the cloud or that cloud is a perfect solution. So it's more a matter of just making sure that clients understand the pros and cons of cloud. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I was also in the independent space at the emergence of the cloud, and anytime there's new technology advancing, there's really two camps. Some are all excited what's coming, those that jump on the bandwagons, and then there's always those that lag behind and are pessimistic and don't trust that anything's ever going to take off. So in the independent angle, we don't want to lean too far in either direction. We want to lead our clients to the right direction. So I think we were proceeding with caution and keeping an open mind, but certainly I wouldn't say we foresaw what's come now and the called a almost full immersion of the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great to see how much technology can evolve in such a short amount of time too. And now, although it feels like we have arrived in the kind of cloud era, if you would, it's without a doubt that these technologies will only continue to evolve and improve over time. But looking at where we are today, there are definitely some software solutions that are more mature in their cloud capabilities than others. So when a company is considering opting into a cloud ERP solution, what are some key factors that will help someone identify the level of maturity that the software has acquired in their migration from on-premise to the cloud? Who wants to go first?
I
Anybody?
can take a first pass at it here. I think the first thing to look at is how long has the solution actually been in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when you look at, if you compare a product like Oracle's NetSuite, that's a product that's been around for over 20 years and it's always been in the cloud. So any R&D dollars and investments they've made in that sort of functionality has been in the cloud. So you don't really have the issue of, is the cloud technology mature or not, because they've just always been in the cloud. And the same is true for Salesforce on the CRM side, and Plex is another one that's more of a manufacturing, shop floor automation, supply chain management type of ERP system. But beyond that, if you're looking at systems that didn't originate in the cloud, which quite frankly is most systems did not start in the cloud, they started off as on-premise type solutions. It's helpful to look at how long have they been moving to the cloud? When did they start the journey? When did they start migrating? But probably even more importantly, it's important just to look at your business requirements and really understand what is it you need and want from the system, and really dive into those potential systems to make sure you really understand what you're getting in that cloud solution. A lot of times companies or vendors will try to sell you on their roadmap or forthcoming capabilities or forthcoming rollouts. They're going to include certain functions that they don't have now. And you want to be real careful with that, because there's no guarantees that functionality will ever come. And the other thing you want to really dive into and fully understand and kind of smoke out is, a lot of vendors out there have their flagship cloud solution, but because it's not complete yet, they also have other systems that they're still using from their legacy environments that are on-prem, that they're using to bolt on to that cloud solution to kind of patch together, a cloud core, but then there's on-premise systems handling some of the other capabilities. So you really want to understand, when a vendor shows you something or is proposing a solution to you, really understanding what really is in the cloud versus something that's going to be a legacy product that I'm just going to have to upgrade later on.
Mm.
Yeah, there's a misconception or misunderstanding sometimes on level of complexity across different systems. If you look at some of the bigger systems, take SAP S/4HANA, trying to move from their ECC roadmap, or look at Oracle ERP Cloud. These are monstrous systems that are navigating in time to the cloud, but there's a whole lot sitting in legacy, which makes it a longer, more difficult transition to the cloud. There's a reason that the original cloud solutions and the majority of things like CRM and some accounting packages are in the cloud. Is that because they're not as complex? They're easier to rebuild into a cloud environment. So when you're looking at the complexity that you need and the depth of what's actually in an ERP system, that should be a big part. What Eric mentioned, a big part of your evaluation is, what do they truly have available in the cloud, and how are they going to fill in the gaps for any other areas?
Okay, interesting. Now, would you say that in some cases companies could be better off sticking with on-premise software solutions instead? And what scenarios would make the most sense to avoid the cloud and stick to the legacy solutions instead?
Yeah, I think the easy answer to that, and I'm curious to what Eric has to say, is if you're already on-premise and you haven't defined a clear need to go to cloud, there might be no reason to do so. If you've got the infrastructure set to manage your own systems, you've got the in-house capabilities, and you've got a need for a robust system, and you've got the structure for it, that might be a reason to keep it in-house, because that transition to the cloud, it's a different mindset. It's a restructuring. You've got to not only change the way you manage things, but the way you handle your systems, the way they're supported, and a whole number of steps to take.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the thing I'd add is that, you don't really know, there is no one size fits all answer. I mean, we don't really know for any given company we first work with, we don't know right away whether or not cloud's going to be the right solution for them or not, until we better understand their business needs and requirements. And you also have to look at things like Brian talked a little bit about cost and that sort of thing, but you also have to look at risk and what the risk tolerance is for your organization, your willingness to change as an organization. That's another thing that people often underestimate, is that if you have a culture of highly tenured employees and you have some really old legacy systems that have been around forever and they've worked fairly well, it's just going to be hard harder to transition away from that, even though the technology is arguably better and it's going to be more sophisticated and longer term might be a great fit. It's still going to be a big jump for a lot of organizations. So I think it's really important to recognize that risk, that there are risks, and fully vet that out and understand kind of what are the pros and cons of staying on premise versus going to the cloud. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, even though the tipping point is clearly upon us right now, and there's still more companies using on-premise systems, but more and more of them are adopting or changing to cloud systems. And maybe in 5 years from now, we won't even be having a discussion anymore about on-premise. I don't know. But I guess the word of caution is that, I've seen a lot of these trends and pendulum swing back and forth, and trends come and go. And who knows, especially the way the 2020s are shaping up so far, who knows what's going to happen in the world of technology, and is there something better that comes along? Are we overemphasizing cloud? Could there be some big security breach in the future that would cause companies to want to scale back and go more on premise? I have no idea. So those are just the kind of things, I guess we don't want to get too caught up into what we think the future is going to be, and everyone's doing something that involves the cloud, so therefore we should. It's really just more important that we as an organization look at what's best for us.
Yeah, absolutely. No one size fits all, kind of, by the sounds of it too. And Eric, you put out a video about the dark side of cloud ERP that I want to touch on. And in that video, you discuss different parties that have had a special interest in pushing the ERP software industry to the cloud, and from investors to vendors to the media, basically. So can you tell us a little bit more about the impact these interests have had on the industry, and what that means for companies considering cloud solutions in their software selection process?
Sure. So the whole premise of that blog post was just to sort of uncover and show how the ERP ecosystem works. And that's part of us being independent. Brian and I and the rest of our team at Third Stage can navigate that maybe a little bit more realistically, just because we understand the biases and the things that happen behind the scenes. But just to simplify what I was saying in that blog, is that software vendors, especially when they're trying to launch or get traction with a new cloud ERP system, they spend a ton of money, not just on R&D, but they also spend a ton of money on marketing and making sure that people want to move to the cloud. And part of how they do that is not just by trying to sell directly to organizations looking for new ERP systems, but they also hire industry analysts to do quadrants and reports and things that show how great their technology is and how important it is to be in the cloud. You have consultants out there that are towing the same line, and then you also have a lot of blurred lines between industry publications and blogs that are putting out truly independent content, but a lot of that is also being sponsored by software vendors. So we get calls all the time with people asking to give quotes for some kind of article they're writing or report they're writing in the media, but it's being sponsored by a vendor, and they have a certain angle that they're trying to chase down. So it's just important to recognize that despite the fact that analysts and vendors and media is all saying everything's great about the cloud, everyone's going to the cloud. If you're not in the cloud yet, you're dead. You read a lot of those real extreme positions out there, and you just have to recognize for what it's worth. It's just a marketing machine meant to get more people to move to the cloud so they make more money. And not to say that's right or wrong for you, but it could be right or wrong for you. So you just have to figure out what the best approach is. So that was really the point, is just to understand those nuances of the industry and to really try to cut through it and take it all with a grain of salt, because it all is very biased. And like Brian and I have been saying, it depends on what your needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, and it helps really peel back the layers and dig deeper into what the driving forces have been in this transition to the cloud. Now, when we come back from a quick break, we're going to dive deeper into the specifics behind the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to cloud computing.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, Our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
I'm Sarah Djokovic speaking with Eric and Brian from Third Stage Consulting. So let's dive into the advantages and disadvantages of cloud ERP solutions. So obviously there are pros and cons that come with nearly every solution. Can you speak on the broad advantages that a cloud ERP solution can bring to an organization that they may not see if they stick with a legacy on-premise software?
Well, I think the first ones that come to mind are, first of all, your upgrades are going to be handled more behind the scenes, and you're going to be more likely to keep up with emerging technologies and advancements in technology without having to take time out of your operations to go do a more formal upgrade or re-implementation as companies used to have to do, in a pre-cloud environment. There's also, I think, for a lot of systems, not all of them, but for a lot of them, especially the systems that have been cloud-based for a long time, there's a sort of a user interface, look and feel, ease of use type of advantage that a lot of these systems have. There are some cost savings or benefits to potentially be had with not having to build out a physical and organizational IT infrastructure to support a big on-premise type of deployment. So those are a few of the cost savings, if you will, that come to mind.
Yeah, one thing I've been talking to some clients about is the integration with what we'll call emerging technologies. Not that you can't do it with on-premise, but there's an ease of access and constant development and integration when you're talking cloud platforms, when you're talking about access to data, usability in some cases of that data, sharing of data. Opens up some risks as well, but one thing you want to look at is where you're going as an organization. Where is it? I think the general theme here is, where are the vendors, per the earlier comment, and tying to the dark side, is where are vendors putting their efforts and money? It is in the cloud. It is on the emergence of those newer technologies, so they tend to integrate a little bit better as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's reverse this. What general disadvantages would a cloud ERP solution introduce to an organization that they may not have experienced if they were to stick with an on-premise software?
Well, the two biggest ones that come to mind are, first of all, the relative lack of flexibility of cloud solutions. So with on-premise systems, for better or for worse, you were able to customize the software and change it to do what you wanted it to do. With cloud solutions, you don't have quite that flexibility, because especially in SaaS or software as a service types of cloud deployments, which is different than a hybrid cloud solution, where you are in a hybrid cloud solution, you would have just an on-premise system, but it's installed somewhere else in the cloud, but you could still customize and do what you want with it. Whereas software as a service is what they call multi-tenant, to where multiple companies are using that same software. Your data and everything is isolated, segregated, secure, but you're using the same software, and there's fairly limited changes you can make to that software because it's being used by hundreds or thousands of companies and users. So that lack of flexibility is one that is underestimated in terms of what the risk and pain might be to go along with that. And the other one that comes to mind, or the other disadvantage that many in the industry don't want to talk about, is the cost. You'll get sales guys that insist the cloud is going to be cheaper in the long term than on-premise, and that's simply not always true. In fact, I would argue that I don't have data to back this, but it could be that it's the inverse, and it's actually more expensive for a lot of organizations. I don't know if it's majority or not, but we see a lot of organizations that end up spending more with their cloud solutions because, yes, maybe they got rid of some servers and staff that they didn't need to support the system longer term, but now, much like leasing a car, you have this ongoing annual subscription fee that's never going to go away. So it's a lot like leasing versus buying a car. In some ways, when you buy a car, you can do whatever you want to it. You can paint it. You can change it. You can add new rims or wheels or whatever you want to do. And eventually you pay it off and you don't have a payment. You just have the ongoing maintenance. But with a lease, the downside of a lease is that you can't change the car. You can't paint it. You can't change the way you got it. And that payment goes on forever, at least until you get another lease. So, to me, the cloud is a lot like the leasing option, where it has its advantages. It works for a lot of organizations, but there's also a potential downside or trade-off that companies have to make too.
That's a great comment. We get calls from a lot of clients who have just gotten to the contract phase thinking, oh, sweet, we're going cloud. And then they realize what it's actually going to cost. They actually run the scenarios, and finally the CFOs get involved and say, hold on, what are we talking, year over year? There's expanded costs around integrations, things that you don't foresee. The support costs when you're bringing in these external parties increase. You're offloading the potential internal cost, but it doesn't go away. So it gets sent around and probably multiple parties externally out, the integration parties, and that's an ongoing cost too. If you're tying to your web portals and all that, it tends to accelerate beyond what people initially think when they get that. If you're going online looking at what NetSuite or Microsoft Dynamics it costs as a SaaS platform, be a little bit cautious of that, because that's just the very base cost and doesn't really look at reality.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And that's actually really relatable to what I'm even going through right now with my own online software research for certain things. I'm like, oh, I see. So over time, this will be actually more. And even though it might have some benefits, but at the same time, they are almost the same thing. So always really important to do some research. And based on everything you've touched on, it seems like the answer to whether one should pursue a cloud-based ERP solution or an on-premise solution is truly just unique to the organization and their specific needs. And when a company is just starting out on their digital transformation, should they include both cloud and on-premise software solutions to their shortlist? Or are there things that they can do to determine whether they should go one way or the other before they start meeting with vendors?
Well, it's becoming more and more common over time that it's getting harder to even find on-premise solutions that are still out there. They do exist. There are systems that you can get that are on-premise. In fact, some vendors have both. They offer cloud offerings, but they also offer an on-premise deployment still. But I think over time, that's the scale's tipping towards more cloud, because ultimately what vendors want is they want to have one cloud solution to be able to support, so they can dump all their R&D dollars in that one solution and not have to worry about managing multiple systems. For the most part, some vendors, there's exceptions because they have distinctly different product lines. Like Oracle, for example, owns NetSuite, and they also own Oracle ERP Cloud. I don't foresee them merging those two systems together, but those are so big and they've got such big install bases, they can kind of survive and coexist together. So I think the question becomes, do you want to look at vendors that have the option for either cloud or on-premise? So in other words, if you're not sold on cloud and you think you might want on-premise, then the question might become, well, maybe I just focus my short list on those vendors that give me the option to do one or the other. It's going to be hard to find many vendors, if any, well-known vendors that are strictly focused on on-premise and don't have a cloud solution, just because that's, like I said, where the industry is going. So I think that's probably the best way to handle it. But even in those cases where you're looking at vendors that have either deployment option available, you just have to think about long-term viability. And is that, if I go with an on-premise option, is that really going to be around in 5 or 10 years? Is the vendor going to cut that off and eventually say, I have to move to the cloud anyway, and so should I just go to the cloud now? Those are the types of questions and discussions that we get into oftentimes with our clients.
Yeah, what we're seeing more actually in recent discussions is those organizations that have on-premise, and they're wondering, is it time to move to cloud? And really what the decision is coming around is it worth sticking with a solution that works and looking at building sort of a best of breed to fill in missing functionality. And those best of breed solutions, by the way, are pretty much always cloud, not all, but generally cloud, versus let's upgrade everything and get to the cloud now. I think that's a more common scenario that we're looking at. And when is the time right to rip and replace? The general thoughts around that are to run a business case. Just to go to cloud because everyone's saying you have to, or because your vendor says you have to, is not a good reason. But if you're starting to see pains in the business, if it's looking it's time to replace your ERP, if it's looking like you need cloud advantages for some reason, then would be the time to start looking at and make sure that it's cost justified to make that jump.
Yeah, awesome. This is all super informative, you guys. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. Now, if listeners want to learn more, what are some resources that you might suggest for them?
Well, in addition to subscribing to this podcast, I would also suggest going to the Third Stage website. That's the company that Brian and I work for. And we're an independent consulting firm, as you mentioned at the intro. And we have a lot of independent technology agnostic resources out there, blogs and white papers and videos and things of that nature. So if you go to thirdstage-consulting.com, that's a great resource where Brian and I are posting constant blogs and videos and that sort of thing, as well as other people from our team.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric and Brian. We're about out of time, but again, thank you so much for being here today and just sharing all these insights with us.
All right. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Brian, for being on the show. That good conversation. It was good to sort of replay that interview for our audience here and learn a little bit more about what some of the pros and cons are. And again, the whole idea here is that we're not suggesting that cloud is good or bad, but just like any analysis or discussion we tend to have on this show or the Third Stage that we have as an organization, we always want to recognize what the risks are. And any hot new trend or any new direction that the industry might be headed may be a net improvement overall, but even if that's the case, you still usually are trading one set of risk for another. So in this case, hopefully we've given you some things to think about and just be aware of, because I think one of the biggest challenges with cloud deployments or any sort of technology transformation is if you go in with unrealistic expectations or a bunch of blind spots, not knowing what to expect, that creates a bunch of problems later on because you don't have a realistic plan or budget or risk mitigation framework. And so hopefully that's helped to uncover that. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back and we're going to bring on our next guest, which I'm excited about, which is Stuart Robb. And we'll do that right after the break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.